I want to begin by saying just how delighted I am to be here and to thank you, Stephen and Isa, for inviting me and asking me to be a part of this event. My presentation is entitled The Crisis of the Social, which is an increasingly unsettled dimension of global governance. The social is an expansive concept, and it is more likely to take on its particular concrete manifestations at the national or local levels, but it's always responding to the global. So one of the things I want to do today is talk about the relationship between income inequality, which I'll shorthand as II, and global governance. Income inequality, or II, is a sine qua non of neoliberal governance. But until recently, the prevailing wisdom has been that income inequality, vast and growing gaps between the rich and the poor, it was less important than extreme poverty, at least drawing the global poor across that $1 and now $1.25 poverty line. Even in advanced economies, the unprecedented growth of wealth among the very rich was welcome to a certain extent as evidence that the entrepreneurial risk premium was working, that in a free market, investment, creativity, and effort is awarded. So someone like Tony Blair, for example, would argue that he was intensely relaxed by David Beckham's salary, provided that child poverty decreased. There was also an article of neoliberal faith that wealth and income disparities are necessary to generate growth and to create jobs. This was a favor of Thatcher and Reagan and many trickle-down theories, and paradoxically seemed to gain some traction in recent years. We only have to look at the articulations of the American Tea Party or this month's federal election to see how this fable unfolds in public discourses. A key plank of the conservative platform was the specious claim that marginal increases in corporate taxes on corporations and the super rich would be a tax on job creators. But since the 2008 crisis, there's international financial institutions and neoliberal policy networks are now shifting their focus from those at the bottom of the income ladder to that yawning space in the middle. That is income gaps, both between rich countries and poor countries and within countries themselves. Well, this is still highly contested. There's a growing consensus that II, income inequality, presents a significant obstacle for the economic and political sustainability of global governance of the project. So what I want to do today is to talk about the extent of II in North America in particular, to review explanations for why it now seems that income inequality is important, and to suggest that in Canada, there's still a fairly robust social literacy, which makes income inequality a matter of debate rather than resignation. So first, turning to incidents. The World Economic Forum's 2011 Global Risk Report identified income inequality and global governance failures and their interrelationship as the two most challenging issues confronting the contemporary global economy. The report argued that globalization has sustained economic growth for a generation, but a minority seem to be harvesting the disproportionate amount of the fruits. The WEF was particularly concerned that the ease of communication in the contemporary environment made these inequalities more visible. But economic inequality is more than a matter of appearance. Gini coefficients, which measure the distribution of income against a hypothetical perfect distribution, have grown significantly and rapidly in the past 3 decades, almost everywhere, and even in countries with robust social policy regimes. Neoliberal fundamentalists contest this characterization, arguing that globalization has actually tempered global inequality. Ginis have dropped from 0.66, which was established in the 1980s, to 0.61. But this decrease largely reflects the successes of emerging economies such as China. And within China, Gini coefficients have grown from roughly 2.4% in the 1980s to 4%, to 0.4 now. So during these same years, advanced economies, many celebrated for their post-war social safety nets, have also experienced marked increases in income inequality. Among OECD countries, real income growth among top earners was twice as large as bottom earners. Of course, there's significant differences among countries. In the mid-2000s, the United States ranked at the top with a Gini coefficient of 0.38, which is up 0.34 from only a few years before, followed by Italy, the UK, and then Canada, Japan, and Ireland all rank around 0.31, 0.32. The growth of income inequality in North America has been deep and rapid. The US, for example, there's not been a single year since 1952 and 1986 when the richest 1% of households earned more than a tenth of national income. But after increasing in the 1980s, by the year 2000, the richest held 18% of the national income. The last time that the United States was in this unequal position was in 1929. So income is being distributed upward. Now, income inequality can occur because the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, or both. And what's happening in Canada is both. So between 1980 and 2005, those in the top 20% had their incomes increased by 16%. Those in the middle, income stagnated. Those at the bottom, their incomes decreased by 20%. And in fact, if you take the average full-time earner, their annual increase in inflation-adjusted dollars over this 25-year period is $53 a year. So many factors combine to produce II. There's a list of usual suspects among all OECD countries, that is an eroding manufacturing sector, growth in low-paid service sector, precarious part-time jobs, and the stagnation of the working wage. But a good part of II is produced through public policy. Tight restrictions in Canada on unemployment insurance means that less than half of those who pay into the program actually collect when they lose their jobs. The federal government has also progressively abandoned the social policy field, reorienting its role from in the post-war, as the post-war guarantor of social security to rather muscular guardian of national security and public safety. Spending priorities have shifted from the social to defense, policing, and incarceration of the socially and racially marginalized and the mentally ill. A recent study recently reported that 1/3 of the inmates in Canadian federal penitentiaries fit that latter category of the mentally ill. At the same time, the social field has been downloaded onto the provinces where there are insufficient resources to fund robust social programs. So the result is that until recently, most provinces have also simply cut away. So between 1995 and 2005, Canadian governments have collectively reduced their spending on social programs from 41% to 31% of the GDP. In the meantime, they've also collected less taxes. And over the last decade, both levels of government have collected $90 billion less in taxes than they did in the early 1990s. That's enough to fund an entire parallel healthcare system. During these same years, wealthy Canadians saw their taxes decrease by 11%, ordinary Canadians, if you like that term, by 1%. So as I noted earlier, the World Economic Forum has identified II as one of the biggest challenges for global governance. But there are actually several discourses that are floating around that make this case. One strand of argument by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in their 2009 book, The Spirit Level, argues that economic inequality makes everyone worse off. And they have a number of statistics to show that in unequal societies, murder rates are higher, teenage pregnancies, and all manner of health indicators, including a lower life expectancy. This argument, which is popular among social democrats, but still neoliberal in its framing, is that II ultimately makes everyone worse off. Policies that promote income redistribution make sense, they argue, if only because it will lower costs in the long run of criminal justice, healthcare, and social services. Now, a second argument, which is tracking among neoliberal economists at the moment, is that II actually is the ultimate cause of the 2008 financial meltdown, which left unaddressed will lead to an even greater crash. Raghuram Rajan, who was a former IMF economist, for example, argues in his book Fault Lines that a stagnating middle class incomes, economic inequality, and a thin social safety net in the US created pressure for governments to ease credit, to stimulate the markets, especially the housing markets, and to create jobs. So Rajan argues that the American consumer became a keystone in a house of cards, buoyed not by robust incomes or a robust economy, but instead, as in the case of Canada, by levels of personal debt that have not been seen since the Great Depression. So the US financial sector, with its skewed incentives, was the critical but unstable link between an overstimulated American economy and an underconsuming world. Rajan argues not for income redistribution, but that education and healthcare should be improved in the United States, and in so doing, improve the stability of the global economy. However, there are now a number of studies which are arguing precisely that the health of the global economy depends primarily on some mechanism of income redistribution. Now, a third rationale is provided by the World Economic Forum themselves, and they're concerned about a political backlash against globalization, which is generated through income inequality, whether through resurgent nationalism, populism, or social fragmentation. Am I doing Claire? Okay. So their argument is that in particular, they're concerned about social and political unrest and social and economic backlash against globalization, and they're pointing to things like the extremist parties in Europe and the US Tea Party. However, if in fact correcting II is on the global agenda, it's not immediately apparent how market governance might correct a problem that is a product of its own governing toolbox and in fact intrinsic to its governing logic. For Peck, Brenner, and others, this apparent dilemma is not as difficult as it might appear because, they argue, neoliberal governance has never been constrained by its own rules, its own logic. It has unfolded precisely in response to its own underperformance and its own outright failures, which have prompted next stage reforms that have pushed the project forward. And I'm thinking out loud here, the apparent risk to global governance apparently posed by II does beg the question of redistribution and the place of the social in the current configuration of market governance. All manner of systemic inequalities have been essentially penciled in to the global governance agenda as a problem that the market will eventually alleviate, although never eliminate as a matter of design. So it's always coming, never arriving. This problem vexed Marx, it vexed Polanyi, who in The Great Transformation argued that the social was the most important invention of the Industrial Revolution. So in the time I have remaining, what I want to suggest that a critical intervening variable in this equation is an idea like social literacy, which, similar to the 1930s, is, I think, the subject of competing discourses in this current moment. And what I mean by social literacy, I'm not referring to a particular package of post-war welfare policies. Instead, I'm gesturing at the ideas that were generative of social welfare regimes in all their variety. Principal among these, the idea of shared fate, a political orientation and subjectivity that understood social risks were not the responsibility of individuals alone. Following from this, social literacy understood markets as being inherently unstable and unequal, and that governments should and can intervene to reduce gaps, cushion hardships, create opportunities, and correct for systemic disadvantage. So it understands these kinds of interventions as a public good, not a public liability. Now, these principles were embedded in what Margaret Summers calls a sociologically driven knowledge culture, built on relational assumptions that have been progressively replaced, she argues, by a market-driven knowledge culture based on market models of society. Market-driven freedom, she adds, may be an illusion, but it's a capacious vision, and it has conquered the social imaginary. But I think it's critical for us to remember that this capture has been neither universal nor complete. A World Values survey, for example, has a question which is a proxy for social literacy. And it asks respondents to place themselves on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 representing full agreement that income should be redistributed, and 10 endorsing the statement that we need large income differences as incentives. Now, not surprisingly, the United States was most likely to agree with the idea that we need income differences with a score of 6.1. But Canada was not far behind with a score of 5.8, which is much different than Germany, which had 4.5, or Switzerland, 3.6. So North Americans have a higher tolerance of II. And if we were to concentrate on the missives of the Tea Party or our own Mr. Harper, we might conclude that the public imaginary has indeed been captured by the capacious vision of the market. However, as Noam Chomsky has recently argued, the attitudes of rank-and-file Tea Party members are understandable. And moreover, ridiculing the Tea Party is a serious error. These are hardworking people, he explains, who thought they were doing the right things, but their income and security have been in free fall for more than a generation. These insecure Americans firmly believe that they've been shafted and that somebody has done it to them, and they want to know who. Chomsky argues that the Palins, the Becks, and all the right-wing talk show hosts by the dozens are the only ones providing them with answers. They have an answer to everything, Chomsky says, a crazy answer, but it's an answer nonetheless. Okay? So contemporary North American politics is very much about a struggle over answers, over social literacy. In Canada, a recent public opinion poll betrays a deep current of social literacy remaining or surviving 3 decades of neoliberal governance. A survey conducted on the eve of the election showed that the majority of Canadians, over 80%, believe that government should reduce the poverty gap, that the tax system is unfair, that taxes are a public good, and that they're meant to improve the quality of life. They also do not fear crime in their neighborhoods. They do not think that tougher punishments, in fact, combat crime. And of course, public health care is their top priority. So why, I'm still asking this question, why did Canadians vote for fighter jets, corporate taxes, and prisons? Well, the obvious answer is that they didn't. More people voted against the Harper government than voted for it. But millions did, and millions more than, or many more than in the last federal election. So what I think I'd like to argue is that the major cleavage being played out in that election and in contemporary Canadian politics, and Canada is not alone in this, is precisely a struggle between the residuals of social literacy and an active production of social illiteracy. And I'll give you 3 examples to end my talk. The first, as in the United States, the idea of taxes has been progressively converted in the public imagination to a mechanism that eliminates jobs, rather than a democratic means to redistribute, to produce public goods, to create jobs. As Harper put it, all taxes are bad. But there's abundant evidence that indicates that public dollars create more jobs than corporate tax cuts. But the specter of job cuts in the wake of a recession is enough to give social illiteracy momentum. It also underwrites the spurious discursive division between so-called job creators and tax consumers, which I think are going to be played out in a major way when budgets come out, particularly focused on public sector workers and pensions. The second and related vector in the manufacturing of social illiteracy is the creation of horizontal antagonisms rather than vertical antagonisms, which is essentially the base for a politics of redistribution. In Canada, horizontal antagonism are staged as wedged politics, which pose ordinary people, the taxpayers, against immigrants, those on social assistance, cultural producers, equity seekers, NGOs, all that can be represented as parasitic on the public sector. And in fact, now with the cuts to political parties, we can also even argue that our political parties are parasitic on the public sector. This well-worn strategy of divide and conquer again revolves around the forced and false distinction between the taxpayer and the tax consumer, and it's also aimed squarely at what Summers calls sociologically driven knowledge culture and the right to have rights. I won't rehearse here the sustained assault on equity groups in Canada. Most of us know them, and they're covered on that website, expletive what Harper did. But it's important to emphasize the reason why the government offers why it is cutting back on equity-seeking groups. It is because they advocate on behalf of the marginalized. So as Alex Neves of Amnesty International argues, the message comes out loud and clear. We will fund service delivery, we will fund organizations that are prepared to feed the poor, but we will not fund organizations that ask challenging questions about why the poor still need feeding and that critique the government's approach. So finally, I want to talk about the cancellation of the long-form census as a way of eliminating a primary source of social knowledge and social knowledge production. Of course, social knowledge has been under attack for some time, and many of us who work in universities know this all too well. However, social statistics play a vital part in social literacy and social production, and are a decided irritant for those with a contrary political agenda. I don't know whether many of you caught when Harper was addressing those that were critiquing his law and order agenda. And his response was that these critics were trying to pacify Canadians with statistics. They're telling you that your personal experiences and impressions are wrong. Crime is not really a problem. These apologists remind me of the Wizard of Oz when the wizard says, "Pay no attention to the men behind the curtain." Social data can subvert political agendas, but it also enables citizens and civil society organizations and governments alike to track across time and space critical indicators of social well-being, including income gaps between the rich and the poor. Census data also play a critical role in breaking down barriers to disadvantaged groups, because these groups make their case by demonstrating, not the least through reliable census data, that they have been systematically denied full inclusion. They have been denied the right to have rights. Okay, so just to conclude, and I don't want to emphasize the role of the census in sustaining social literacy, because ultimately it's social scientists, activists, and citizens who help give these data political meaning, making them part of the broader answer, maybe what Richard was talking about this morning as about horizons of necessity and desire. At the same time, I think the cancellation of the long-form census, and in fact the closing down of every kind of social knowledge production unit in the federal government, speaks to a broader question about the shift in biopolitics to securitization. Why would any modern government prefer not to know about the social needs, the social complexion, and social inequalities in the population that it governs? It's an important question, and I think we should think about it. Thank you.